It's my great pleasure because I had just mentioned that we are publishing a paper. The thinking, the understanding, the grasp of what is going on in this society, what is going on in the lives of young people in this society is kind of central to this paper. And the students in our different cohorts are examples of that. And so we relied significantly on the work of Dr. William Stixrud. Dr. Stixrud is a neuropsychologist, and he is a clinical neuropsychologist who has been in private practice since 1985. He's a member and an adjunct faculty of Children's National Medical Center, and he holds a faculty appointment as assistant clinical professor of psychiatry at the George Washington School of Medicine. He's previously held an appointment at Georgetown University Medical School and has served as consultant to the Division of Neuropsychology at the National Institutes of Health. For the past 20 years, he's been extensively involved in the training and supervision of psychologists and learning specialists. He's also a frequent lecturer on topics related to neuropsychological assessments, learning, and executive disorders, brain development, brain-based learning, motivation, and the effects of stress and sleep deprivation on the brain. He's the author of a book, Plain Talk About Early Education and Development, and he's an author of this national bestseller, The Self-Driven Child. I think the physicians who have graduated from Stritch and have taken this class and have benefited from Dr. Stixrud's class have the benefit of not only transcendental meditation, but the insights in this book. Dr. Sunny Nakai, who is a dean here, said this was the best book on parenting that she ever read. And I highly recommend this book. I highly recommend that you read our paper when it comes out. And I want to welcome Dr. Stixrud, who's a very dear friend and an extraordinary human being, extraordinary teacher. Dr. Stixrud.
Thank you so much, Carla. You hear me okay? Okay. So let me just show my screen here. Hey, folks. Nice to be here. Thank you, Carla, so much. I haven't had mac and cheese in 15 years. It was really good. So I'm a clinical neuropsychologist, and I test kids and teenagers and young adults who are having attention problems or learning problems or emotional problems or social problems. And I try to figure out what's going wrong, what's right, how we can help them. And I've done it for 40 years and never get tired of it. In part, I love what kids say. I've written down hundreds of funny things that the kids have said and done. But I think my favorite is actually the same, 3 kids said exactly the same thing. And right before the pandemic, within about 2 years, these 3 kids, they're sitting across the table from me. I'm testing them. And they look off to their left and they see a picture of me in a tuxedo and my daughter in a wedding gown. And all 3 kids said, "You got married?" I said, "Well, yeah, I did like 40 years ago." And all 3 kids said with disgust in their voices, said, "You married your daughter?" It's a pretty fun way to make a living. Let me just. I'm going to talk to you about development. And I focus on young people's development, and there's a lot that's going on. I'm sure if you just read the New York Times or ever look at the Washington Post, there's an article at least once a week about this crisis in mental health affecting teenagers and young adults. And I was asking the guy who's the head of all the pediatric anxiety and depression research at the National Institutes of Mental Health a couple of years ago, and he's been there forever. And I said, is it really true that there's more anxiety and more depression in young people than there used to be? They said, well, it's hard to tell from studies in some ways because the way they measure anxiety or depression differs. He said, the thing that's incontrovertible is this dramatic increase in completed suicides, which is just, even in kids 5 to 11, it was seen this, and since the pandemic, there's a 50% increase in ER visits for suicidality. And so we have this, and some of the families that I work with, the kids I work with are very high achieving kids who are hell-bent on going to an Ivy League college. And they have the sense that if they have to get depressed, if they have to go to antidepressants, they have to have an anxiety disorder while they're in high school, it'll be worth it if they get into a good enough college. And it ain't. I mean, anybody know about the work of Laurie Santos at Yale? Anybody else? She's a psychologist at Yale who lived in residential dormitories with Yale undergraduates for years. She may still, but she was struck by the fact that these kids got themselves arguably in the most prestigious university in the world, and they were miserable. They're sleeping 46 hours a night. They were constantly pressured, constantly stressed, constantly competitive. So they just didn't enjoy anything about being at Yale. That didn't do it. I tested 2 kids, honest to God, within the last two months, who they're high school seniors. They're both really sweet boys. They're completely anxious, obsessively driven to achieve, very high achievers. And I asked them, is there a time, tell me about some times when you feel happy. And both of them said, I felt happy the day I got into college. That's all I could think of. So we have this really it's a pretty severe situation. And the challenge for you folks is that physicians are much higher risk than the general population for depression and for suicide. And so I want to talk about how this stuff develops and why TM, in my opinion, TM is so important as a tool for addressing this. Now, we're talking about a crisis across the social economic spectrum, in the sense that we know what a devastating effect poverty has on the development of the brain, on mental health. And some of you know about this research in affluent families and high-achieving schools. This woman by the name of Sunya Lither, 20 years ago, was doing a study on kids in poverty. And one of the contrast groups she used was this group of affluent kids. And she was stunned to learn that these affluent kids were much more likely to have anxiety disorders, depression, substance use disorders, delinquency, self-harm than middle-class kids or even kids living in poverty. And the hypothesis, and this, I just read a paper recently, a couple of years ago, where they've been following this cohort of affluent kids who attended high-achieving schools. And the substance use disorder risk increased at least until the mid-20s, and that's as far as they studied it. And the hypothesis causes are this excessive pressure to excel, and affluent kids on average don't feel as close to their parents, in part because of the pressure they feel to achieve. And it turns out that the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation wrote an article in 2008, did a study in 2018, looking at the causes of adolescent unwellness. And the top 4 were poverty, trauma, discrimination, and excessive pressure to excel. So it's a big deal. It's extremely prevalent. And then we got this loneliness. And in terms of millennials, like 30% feel lonely much of the time. Like 60% of the adult population is lonely. And these folks are going to be your patients. So we got our hands full here. And I want to say something about, I can't even read that. I don't know what happened here. So here's the idea that anxiety and depression are both, they're both stress-related disorders in the sense that they both involve a dysregulated stress system. And anxiety almost always precedes depression. You know, I made up a little formula for getting depressed, and I made it up, but I think it's pretty serviceable. And it's being too tired and too stressed for too long. Because people generally if they get anxious for a long time, it kind of wears down the stress response and they get depressed. And also, one of the things we learned 20 years ago was that if a kid or a teenager or a young adult gets depressed or develops an anxiety disorder, that it changes the brain in a way that doesn't doom them, but it makes them more vulnerable to periods of anxiety and periods of depression, really throughout their life. And what it does in part is that even when you get better, you take medicine, all the stress goes away and you feel better, you still may be more somewhat pessimistic than you used to be, or you may have more insomnia. And we know that getting depressed changes the way you experience reward. It diminishes the pleasure you get from positive experiences. I mentioned this slide, you have a magnifying glass, you can read it, but a couple formulas that people have proposed for developing emotional resilience. And one, Tina Tane Bryson says, it's adversity plus support. That you develop resilience by handling hard things and successfully handling them with support if necessary. And then it changes your brain because you realize, I can handle hard things. And secondly, this psychiatrist who I saw lecture at a conference about TM says it's stress plus rest. And there's a really, let's see, do I want to get this? Yeah, I'll get this. So there's a really interesting set of studies. Michael Meany is one of the top psychologists in the world, and he does rat studies and he helped pioneer the field of epigenetics in psychology. And what he did is he took these rats who these baby rats, and he separated them from their mothers. And their mothers happened to be high licking and grooming rats, which means not very stressed. The more stressed the mothers are, the less they lick and groom their young. And so he separated them from 15 minutes a day, and they're handled by graduate students in a way that's pretty stressful. And so what happened was that this happened for 2 weeks. The first couple of weeks of these rats' life, they got separated, something very stressful happens. They come back to their mother, who licks and grooms them and restores them. And this experience of being from stress to recovering. Basically, Meany said these rats were like California laid-back rats as adults because it's almost impossible to stress. Another group was separated for 2 hours a day, and they became just as toxic stress. They couldn't handle it. They became nervous rats. Another really interesting study. Meany fostered baby rats from low licking mothers, got a high stress licking mothers, to low stress mothers, high licking and grooming. They also became California laid-back rats, even though they're genetically programmed to be anxious. So this idea of being stressed and recovering is a big deal. And so in my work, I'm thinking about development in general, but there's at least four things that I'm focusing on. And one is I want young people to develop an efficient stress response. And what that means is that something stressful happens, that your stress hormones jack up. You have your cortisol level spikes, so you can deal with an emergency, something really stressful. And then when it's over, it goes down quickly. And second is high stress tolerance. There's simply this ability to function well in stressful situations as opposed to avoiding them, or opposed to panicking or freaking out. And this resilience, this ability to bounce back quickly, and this increasing peace and clarity and sense of interconnectedness, which is just makes life so much more fulfilling. And I think that TM plays a huge role in this part. Now, what's a sense of control? This is my main thing now, the sense of control. I hope you'll see why. What's this got to do with it? In 2008, I heard this world-class neuroscientist lecture. And she said, I defy you to think of things that are stressful, that you can't summarize with the acronym NUTS. The idea is stress makes you nuts. And so it's the novelty in the situations, unpredictability, is perceived threat to be physical threat or threat to the ego, fear of being embarrassed or left out or whatever, and a low sense of control. And the stress scientists say it's that low sense of control is the most stressful, because you can be in a new situation. A lot of new situations can be really fun, or even in an unpredictable situation. Things are always the same. It's boring. Or even a situation that feels threatening, that if you have a sense, I've been here before, I can handle this. It's not that big a deal. It's when something's happened and you don't know what to do. When you have that something's out of your control. That's the thing, that's the most stressful experience in life. And so in my co-author and I, several years ago, we're thinking, how do we organize the ideas in our first book? What's the organizing principle? And we thought, well, if we have this crisis, even back then, even 7 years ago, of mental health in young people, and mental health problems are rooted in stress. These are stress-related problems. And a low sense of control is the most stressful thing you can experience. This must be a big deal. We also happen to know that sense of control or autonomy is absolutely the key to develop healthy motivation, that self-motivation, that drive to develop yourself, as opposed to kind of slacking off, doing as little as possible, or being obsessively driven. So I talk, this doesn't recover from stress, I'm just listening to this for a minute. And just I'll kind of a couple of things about the brain. And certainly, you all know the prefrontal cortex, the most recently evolved part of your brain, right behind the forehead, that does all the executive functions. The amygdala, the very primitive part of your brain that doesn't think, it just senses and reacts to threat. I think about the amygdala as like a threat detector, that will start your stress response if it senses that some danger there. I also mentioned the hippocampus, the major memory center in your brain, which is close to the amygdala. My one, let's see. Emotions in the brain are very complicated, but so this is arguably still the best marker of mental health is the strength of the connections. It's actually the white matter, the red lines of the white matter connecting the prefrontal cortex and then both sides of the amygdala. Is the strength of the connections between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. And that's because what happens is that when you're stressed, ideally what happens is your prefrontal cortex activates. And when the prefrontal cortex activates, it dampens the stress response. And so you go into coping mode as opposed to freaking out, or opposed to avoiding. And so the stronger the connections between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, the better your ability to regulate, to be thoughtful, to handle things, to go into coping mode, to activate the prefrontal cortex, and dampen down the stress response when something stressful happens. And we know that you lose a night of sleep, you can actually see the white matter decrease in the connections here. You're under high stress, same thing. We know that sleep restores it, meditation seems to restore it, exercise it can be a big tool for this too. But so I wanted you to know that, and I'll just mention, this won't be a big surprise to you, if you think about it, which is the prefrontal cortex. There's a scientist at Yale who says, it's the Goldilocks of the brain, meaning that the neurotransmitters that run the prefrontal cortex, namely dopamine and norepinephrine, have to be in this very delicate balance in order to function well. And you think about how hard it is to concentrate and to organize your thinking if you're stressed. And because we evolved if we're threatened, we evolved to focus on the threat, because if we didn't focus on the threat, we get eaten. So that's why it's so hard if you're really stressed to focus on your work when you're worried about failing or you're worried about whatever it is. But so stress hormones will jack up the level of dopamine, level of norepinephrine in the brain, and basically take the frontal lobe offline. And so, which it becomes impossible to focus, impossible to learn really under high stress. Have any of you seen this? It's called the Yerkes-Dodson curve, and it was developed about 100 years ago by these two psychologists who studied arousal levels. What they found is not surprisingly, low levels of arousal are related to poor performance. If you're an athlete and you're playing a team that's really crummy, It's hard to get it up to really kind of play your best. You're going to play your best. It's when you have this certain level of arousal that optimizes your performance. There's a lot of work being done now on anxiety and stress, where people say, that you need a certain optimal level of cortisol and other stress hormones to really function optimally and be adaptive. If you have to perform in any kind of way, you take a test, you don't want to be sluggish. You want an elevation of cortisol, but you don't want it over the top, because if it goes over the top, the prefrontal cortex shuts down and you can't think. And this isn't pretty either, but people who are highly stressed for a long time, the amygdala gets bigger and more reactive. As Robert Sapolsky, the great scientist, stress scientist, says, it becomes more hysterical, more reactive. The prefrontal cortex becomes smaller and less connected, as they said. And the hippocampus shrinks. So it's not pretty. And the study was, I haven't seen anything since then, but a study was done on medical students studying for board exams. And what they found is the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex shrunk in a couple of months prior to exams. Now, it recovered. They were able to recover after the exams were over. But the question is, if that goes on for 6 months, do you still recover? It's still kind of unknown. Oh, hold on. One of the ways that I got to the sense of control, besides that nuts thing I told you about, was there's this guy at the University of Colorado. He's a professor emeritus now, but he studies. He also studies rats, and he's the guy who really helped with a sense of control on the map. And the basic paradigm of studies is rat A and rat B. They're in a plexiglass cage, and there's an electrode on their tail, and there's a wheel inside the cage. Rat A gets shocked. The tail gets shocked, and it's not painful, but it's annoying, and he wants it to stop. And he discovers if he turns the wheel, the shock stops. Rat B gets shocked, turns the wheel, and nothing happens. His shock only stops when rat A turns the wheel. And so rat A, what happens is when he's turning the wheel, as I mentioned, his prefrontal cortex activates. And when the prefrontal cortex activates, it dampens down the stress response. So he's turning that wheel and he's not very stressed because he's coping with it. And you do this several times. He has this experience of successfully coping with it, that you disconnect the wheel and it's still no big deal. He's just turning that wheel and he keeps running and it's not that big a deal. Rat B becomes extremely easily stressed. And the conclusion is, rat A developed a sense of control, of being able to control or to manage a stressful situation. Rat B did not. And so some of you know the construct of learned helplessness. Heard this? So the paradigm in the learned helplessness research was you'd have dogs in a cage, and the dogs would be shocked, and they couldn't escape. So after being unable to escape several times, they'd open the cage door and the dogs wouldn't go out. They'd just stay in the cage and shiver and panic. And the conclusion was they learned a sense of helplessness. This Steve Mayer, who helped pioneer this idea of learned helplessness, and Martin Seligman, who later founded the field of positive psychology, developed this learned helplessness hypothesis. And what they concluded, they wrote a paper in 2017 called Learned Helplessness at 50. What they concluded is those dogs didn't learn helplessness. They failed to learn control. They failed to learn a sense of control. So it's a really big deal. And I'll just mention, when I showed you that Yerkes-Dodson curve, I was a pretty good college student. And I got myself into the top PhD program in English literature at Berkeley right out of college. But I got really anxious my last 2 years of college, and for various things that had happened to my family. And I started graduate school, and I was so anxious and insecure that I went for 20 straight weeks without turning in an assignment. I mean, I couldn't read for more than 12 minutes at a time. And when I work with underachievers, I said, 20 weeks, nothing. Turning in nothing. Top that. But So, but in any case, when I was in Berkeley, during these 20 weeks, I was living with this guy, and he just learned Qigong. And I remember one morning he came down for breakfast, and he said, when I meditate, my shoulders just feel weightless. And I kind of went blah, blah, blah. I didn't pay attention. And a couple of days later, he said, Bill, you're the most nervous person I've ever met in my life. If there's anybody on this planet who needs to learn to meditate, it's you. So I went home to Seattle, where I'm from, after I flunked out, and thinking that my whole life had gone up in smoke. And I learned Qigong, and I was working in a warehouse. I was just filling orders. I had no idea what I was going to do with my life, but I was just filling orders in a warehouse. And I'd been meditating for about a month. And my foreman came up to me on a break. He said, "What do you want?" And I thought he suspected I was on drugs. He turned me. And he said, "I said, what are you talking about?" He said, "Well, when you started here, you're the most nervous person I've ever met. Now you seem so calm." He thought I was taking Quaaludes, and that he was drug seeking. So I said, "It must be the meditation." So let me show So what a sense of control is. It's really the subjective sense of agency or autonomy, the kind of internal locus control. This is my life. I can direct my own life. It's the confidence that I can handle stressful situations. If you're really confident, you can handle stuff. You're very anxious, right? And thirdly, it's that brain state that supports it with the prefrontal cortex regulating the amygdala. And so what it isn't, it's not feeling helpless or hopeless or passive or resigned or stuck. And it's not feeling overwhelmed. We're not feeling just chronically anxious and exhausted and driven. I mean, and you think about it from a mental health point of view. If you feel anxious, your thinking's out of control, right? You'd like to stop worrying, but you can't. You can't stop yourself from worrying. If you feel depressed, you have very little sense of control, and it's oftentimes hard to get out of bed. If you have a substance use disorder, no sense of control. Your life feels completely chaotic. So it really is central to mental health problems, and also it's looking increasingly that various things that improve mental health do so by increasing the sense of control. Some of you know cognitive behavioral therapy. It's probably the most well-researched. It's with young people, treatment for anxiety and depression. And people are saying now that the reason that cognitive therapy works, that cognitive behavioral therapy helps people feel less anxious and improves their mood, is it increases their sense of control. And the slide here just talks about some of the things that you're taught in CBT that increases the sense of control. And I was just reading a study recently that was done in Germany during the pandemic. It was on exercise and the effect of exercise on mental health. And not surprisingly, young adults who exercised had better mental health. And the title of the scientific article about this study was, "It's all about control," because it looked like the mechanism for them feeling better was they improved their sense of control. And I was struck years ago, one of the early studies on TM concluded that it increases your internal sense of your internal locus of control, that internal sense that I can direct my life. Now, that's interesting, because if you try to control TM itself, it doesn't work. If you try to force thoughts out of your mind or concentrate on your mantra, it doesn't work. But that experience of effortlessly relaxing your mind and body and experiencing that inner quietness, it actually increases your sense of control, in part because you feel confident, you can handle stuff. You don't have the experience of being emotionally overloaded as much. I remember when I went back to graduate school about a year after being meditating, I felt like I had an unfair advantage, just because I could just handle stuff so much better than many of my classmates. I mentioned this learned helplessness study. And so sense of control, it's good for everything, in part, because it makes the brain work better. So these are various ways that it's good. And this is my favorite cartoon about a low sense of control. So here's that study I just telling you about the Meany, Michael Meany's work with the fostering of the pups. And in our book, in both of our books, we talk about the idea for families, of parents being a non-anxious presence in the family. And I love it. I didn't make this idea up. I wish I did. I got it from a guy by the name of Edmund Friedman, who was a family therapist and a rabbi. And he worked with systems. He worked with families and worked with churches and schools and corporations. And he concluded that systems work best if the people in charge are not highly anxious and emotionally reactive. And you think about it as a parent. I mean, any parents in here? As a parent, that it's much easier to soothe an infant if you stay calm. You got a 3-year-old in the store; it's a lot easier to deal with it if you stay calm. You got a 15-year-old who comes home and just flunked a test, or his girlfriend dumped him. It's a lot easier to be helpful if you don't get real upset yourself. So I love this idea. I think it's really relevant to physicians. It's really anybody in a helping profession being able to you know, if I was a physician and they look at my X-ray and they say, "Oh my God," I must have them have kind of a calm attitude about it. We know that there's a concept called stress contagion. And the idea is if you're around somebody who's highly stressed, you pick it up, right? Yeah. And they do studies, for example, where a mother's holding a newborn, and the mother's given a stressful task to do. And as the mother gets more stressed, the newborn's cortisol level goes up as well. You got a kid sitting in a classroom with a burned out teacher, or a teacher has higher cortisol levels than if he has a teacher who really is enthusiastic about what they're doing. So we know that stress is contagious. We also know that the slide says that calm is contagious. And actually, I just learned recently that calm is contagious is a mantra of the Navy SEALs, who have to go into these really high stress situations and try to calm them down. And the idea, because all emotions are contagious. Yeah, I know this family. The boy's an adult now. When he was 17, he has autism. When he was 17, he and his mom learned TM, and they live in New York, pretty well connected. And so the mom had a reporter from the New York Times come and interview them about TM. And the boy was asked, "What do you notice from meditating?" And the kid said, "TM calms the mind and it calms the mom." And one of my friends, after he retired, was a volunteer policeman for a few years in Herndon, Virginia, the suburb of DC. And he about a year ago, he went to this awards ceremony, and they gave him and some other people awards. And the head of the whole Herndon police force learned TM. And the head of the police force was talking at this banquet. She gave a lecture, and she said that I didn't meditate at all for a couple of months. I was just so busy. I finally made myself do it, and I did it regularly. It was kind of life-changing. And my daughter, if I missed a meditation, my daughter would say, "Mom, you better meditate because you're a much better mom when you meditate." So, and I'll just mention one other thing a couple. So the default mode network in the brain? Anybody familiar with this? This is so interesting because with MRI, they look at the difference between the resting state, what's happening in the brain, what's activating the brain during the resting state, versus when you're actually doing a task. But it wasn't until the late 1990s that people started to study what's going on during that resting state. And what it turns out, if you're in an MRI scan, and you just got nothing to do, you're just lying there, what do? You think about yourself. You think about your life. You think about your past. You think about your future. And it turns out that when you're not focused on a task, what activates in your brain is this pretty well demarcated network, this interconnected brain systems that had to do with self-reflection, had to do with memory, had to do with projecting into the future. And think of it, isn't that if you're sitting, you got nothing to do. That's what you do. That's how your brain works. And this default mode uses 80% of the brain's energy. It's disrupted. The functioning of the default mode is disrupted in every mental health disorder, Alzheimer's. It's really a big deal. And there's a lot of concern with young people being so constantly interconnected, constantly on a device, that they don't have sufficient time to really to activate that default mode, because we know that one of the things that characterizes mental health is that very efficient shifting or toggling between focus on a task and that default mode. And the concern, and we also know that having periods of being off task, daydreaming, mind wandering, hugely related to creativity, hugely related to problem solving. And in young people, absolutely necessary for developing a sense of empathy and a coherent sense of identity. So there's some current concern that people need to take out their earbuds more and just have some time for this to reflect themselves. And that's partly why, in my opinion, why TM is so valuable, because we know, and I'll talk about this in a minute, we know that it activates the default mode. Unlike kinds of meditation where you actually have to focus on something, the fact that it's just effortless, activates the default mode. And when you sit afterwards and you rest for 2 minutes or 3 minutes, again, what activates is that default mode. And just so you get practice going from highly focused to that default mode, and that toggling back and forth. Again, one of the markers of mental health. And this is kind of cool for medical students. Talk about this with medical students, but my author and I, co-author and I, we talk about radical downtime. And the idea is that in the Vedic culture in India, they say that rest is the basis of activity. But the quality of how rested you are affects your activity. And it seems to me that the balance between rest and activity has gotten way out of whack. That even since just the advent of electric light, people started sleeping 2 to 3 hours less night than they did adults. And so we need so much more quiet. And so the idea is, some people say, well, my downtime is gardening or knitting or listening to Led Zeppelin or whatever. And I'm saying we need more radical downtime, given how fast-paced, how highly stressed, how under-rested we are. And sleep, as you know, and again, this is kind of cruel to talk about, but I focused it. There's all kinds of literature on sleep and learning. You know that in my first book, I said I'd much rather teach people for 4 hours who'd slept for 8 than teach them for 8 if they slept for 4. I mean, just the difference. I mean, if you're up for 19 hours, you're more cognitively impaired than you are if you're legally drunk. I mean, and we know that I focused in part on the learning piece, but also on the sense of control, this mental health piece and the sense of control. We know that if you lose a night's sleep, your amygdala is 60% more reactive. We know, as I said earlier, if you lose a night's sleep, you can actually see the weaker connections between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. That if you memorize a list of words before you go to bed, and some of the words are neutral words like table or plate, and other words are death or pain, or other words are sunshine and flowers. If you lose sleep, you're much more likely in the morning to remember the negative words more than the positive or neutral words. And this guy at Harvard, Robert Stixrud, says it's like a negativity bomb. Some of you know the book Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker, a brilliant book on sleep. Jim knows it. And he what he's looked at is that if you lose REM sleep, because during REM sleep, it turns out that It's the only time during 24-hour cycle where your brain is basically devoid of stress hormones. And so the notion is that during dream sleep, you are replaying experiences and emotional memories in basically a stress-free chemical environment. And he said that's why things look better in the morning. And if we deprive ourselves of that we lose this benefit of what Walker calls overnight therapy. Clearly, I remember when my kids were in college and also in graduate school, and they'd come home on a break, and they looked really tired to me. And I'd make a comment, I'm not tired. And they'd sit down to watch TV, and they'd be asleep within 2 minutes, which is profound sleep deprivation in the middle of the day. Profound, and but it impairs. But certainly one of the functions of the prefrontal cortex is it evaluates. It's our self-reflection, our self-evaluation. So the tireder you are, the harder it is to tell how tired. And we also know that simple lack of sleep in itself can trigger anxiety, mood disorders. And again, here's the formula I just made up for becoming depressed, and there it is. I love that. I could stick with that for a while. Now, well, how are we doing time-wise? Okay. So I want to tell you, I mentioned this Laurie Santos, who started teaching that what she did, I can't remember if I said it. She, I talked about it so much. She started teaching when she realized how miserable the undergraduates at Loyola. She started teaching the first course that they're on the science of happiness. And it quickly became the most popular course in the history of Yale University, 300-year history, by far. Because these young people are desperate to understand what makes you happy. And Martin Seligman, who I mentioned earlier, who the guy who studied, he studied and learned helplessness early in his career. And he after a while, he said, psychology has just studied misery. Why don't we study happy people and see what they're like? And so he founded this field of positive psychology. And he has this model of what makes people happy. And he summarized it with this acronym PERMA. And so it's a positive emotion. And I want to mention that, this is interesting, that anxiety, or ADHD, which I see a ton of, autism, I see a ton of, it seemed to be about 80% genetic. In the sense, if you got identical twins, who has one or the other, there's an 80% chance that the other one will too. A little less so with fraternal twins or just simple. And with anxiety disorders and depression, it's more like 35 or 40%. So there's genetic load. But it takes a certain amount of stress. What they say is that stress pulls the genetic trigger. So that you got this genetic vulnerability. But if you could have a genetic vulnerability for anxiety disorder or depression, and if you don't have prolonged stress and prolonged sleep deprivation, you may never get depressed. You may never develop an anxiety disorder. So what I'm saying here is that there's a lot we can do. That there's genetic limits on that positive emotion, but there's so much that we can do with the hand we're dealt. We can exercise, we can meditate, there's various things that we can do. Medical school, you probably a little harder than probably other times in life, but there's a lot we can do to modify that positive emotion. It's active engagement, it's deep engagement with something we're passionate about. And part of the reason, in my opinion, young people, high achieving young people are often very unhappy, is they just feel like they're just jumping through hoops. They aren't really meaningfully engaged in stuff that's important to them. So it's that deep engagement, it's relationships. Some of you made the study where they've followed these men who graduated from Harvard. The study's been going on for like 80 years. And not the same men, but the study of men, these graduates from Harvard, what they find by far the best predictor of happiness. It's not how much money they make. It's not having gone to Harvard. It's their relationships. And I'll just tell you, it's so interesting. I just saw this study where lawyers, what they found was lawyers, what predicted happiness was autonomy, that sense of control, the sense of being connected with people they work with. Where they went to law school, how much money they made, whether they made law review, had no effect at all. So young people grow up with this illusion, with really kind of delusional thinking, that if they achieve at a high enough level, that I talked to these kids in before the pandemic. I was lecturing in Houston about my first book, and I asked this group of student leaders, how many of you want to be happy as adults? And they all kind of sheepishly were ready to die. And so I said, what do you understand it takes to be happy as an adult? And this one kid said, well, I think we all understand that if we get into a good enough college, everything is set. And I'm going, oh God, they need to learn this stuff, because intuitively we tend to be terrible judges. We tend to be terrible at predicting what's going to make us happy. If I give you $20 and you spend it, it'll increase your happiness briefly. But if I give you $20 and you give it to somebody else, it'll significantly bump up your happiness for a week. There's things like that. We're just spending money on other people. If you're going to commuting to work, that you think, well, because I have time to myself. You're happier if you sit next to and start to talk to a stranger. So I'm just saying that we aren't very. It's the science of happiness, because we're poor predictors. The science of happiness can really help us here. So it's the positive emotion, the engagement, the positive relationships, the meaningful, and the accomplishment. And so the accomplishment is not trivial, but it's 20% of the equation. And so let me talk to a little bit, last few minutes here, about TM as a tool for supporting your development. And partly what it does, I mentioned these 4 goals. So by strengthening this frontal amygdala connectivity, you have a healthier stress response. You're less reactive. And I had this experience in, just about 25 years ago. There's something called there's a field called neurofeedback. It's a branch of biofeedback that uses brainwaves. You learn how to kind of modify brainwaves. And in the late 1990s, it was being research was suggesting this is going to make Ritalin unnecessary. It's going to be a great treatment for ADHD and anxiety disorders. So I went down to the University of Tennessee, and I spent 3 days with a one-on-one tutorial with a professor who'd pioneered this field of neurofeedback. And the first thing he showed me was the assessment program. He said, Bill, you be the subject, and I'll show you the program. So he puts a couple of EEG leads in my head. He says, so first thing you have people do is close your eyes. So Bill, go ahead and close your eyes. So I closed my eyes. And within about 5 seconds, he said, Jesus Christ. He said, the second you close your eyes, this big, beautiful burst of alpha waves. I said, well, I've been meditating for 25 years. He said, that's what it looks like. That's obvious. And inside I was thinking, this is pretty cool. Because 25 years ago, 3 people told me I was the most nervous person they've ever met. You know? And now I just have these kind of peaceful brainwaves. But we also, this, I'm sure people have lectured about this increase in the coherence in the frontal cortex, increased brain integration, which leads to improved attention, executive functions, stimulating the default mode network I mentioned, improves sleep. And just, I felt that TM is increasingly crucial for just because that's mind wandering, the mind scattering, the effects of technology, that increased sense of wholeness. I'll talk a little bit about these quiet time schools, and also about, I'll finish by saying this kind of mind-blowing research that was done 30-some years ago at a prison. So first thing is certainly, have you seen this slide before, do you know? So we know that we have this nice increase in alpha waves in the prefrontal cortex, this increased coherence in the cortex and connectivity in the brain. We see this kind of damping down of the amygdala and subcortical stress systems in TM. Again, strengthening the connection between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, allowing you to put things in perspective. So something stressful is hard to happen. As you meditate more, You just, oh, it's not that big a deal. You put it in perspective. Whereas if you're really tired and you're really stressed, it's hard to keep things in perspective. And certainly just the basic decrease in baseline cortisol, your major stress hormone. There's a stress hormone that does the most damage when you're chronically stressed. And this faster recovery, this developing an efficient stress response, where I was surprised when I first saw this study years ago, where they found that people have been meditating for quite a long time. If something really stressful happened, their cortisol level would jack up quickly. I thought, well, that maybe should just kind of just go up a little bit. It didn't, because it's adaptively. When something really stressful happens, you want a nice jack in stress response so that you go into that kind of coping mode. But you want it to go down quickly. And what we find with TM is that baseline cortisol levels go down. In an emergency, something really stressful, they go up nicely. And then when it's done, they go down. And we know that in the wild, if a zebra is chased by a lion and it survives, its cortisol levels normalize in about 45 minutes. And because we can think about the past and the future, we can maintain high cortisol levels for a long time. Part of the reason that TM's so bad. This is another window on this frontal brain coherence, as opposed to just being eyes open. And I collaborated on a couple studies 10 years ago, a little bit longer, on TM and ADHD. We went to these two schools where kids have learning disabilities and ADHD. And most of the kids practice TM for 3 months. And we got the first study, it was just a pilot study, but there's so much interest in something that could really help with ADHD that wasn't medicine, that we were written up all over the world. It was just, even before it had any data, it was weird. But we got nice data, and we interviewed the kids at the end of the first study. And they all said, I'm much less stressed. Their anxiety levels went down 50% in 3 months. And most of them said, I can do my homework better by myself. I'm better organized. And this one kid, Carl and Doug have heard this. Right, Jim, you've heard this story many times. But this one kid who was wildly impulsive at the beginning of the study, he said, before I started meditating, if I was walking in the hall and somebody bumped me, I just turn around and hit him. But now I've been meditating, if I'm walking in the hall and somebody busts me, I stop and think, should I hit him or not? I just improving that inhibitory control. You see a stronger connection, that ability to inhibit and be more thoughtful. And also the second study we did for Fred Travis, lectured to this group, right? Fred did the EEG part. And I mentioned this guy I went to work with in Tennessee to learn neurofeedback. He came up with this theta beta ratio, that the ratio between kind of daydreaming theta waves and more faster focused beta waves is a good marker of ADHD. It is. You see that too much theta, not enough beta. And so people would do 80 sessions of neurofeedback at some expense, and schlepping to do it, to try to come close to normalizing it. Basically, TM in 3 months in these middle school kids normalized the theta beta ratio. So what's that? For free. Yeah. And this default mode, again, I think that that this is one of, if you look at like mindfulness meditations where you're focusing on, so you're trying to maintain awareness, you don't see this activation of the default mode. You see it really in that effortless transcending part. And I just look here. We know that all kinds of studies for years show decreased stress. This is just gives you a sense of the difference in the treatment effect of TM versus some other things. And just David R. Johnson did a meta-analytic study in 2014 looking at studies of anxiety. And what he found was that people whose anxiety levels on a measure of anxiety were above the 90th percentile. That their anxiety levels went down to 50 percentile very, very quickly. Dramatic decrease in anxiety. And I was in Florida in January lecturing, and I was talking to the scientist Mark Nestor, who studied these physicians, and you talk about it in your paper, Carla, and but who studied these physicians and PAs and nurses in hospitals during the pandemic. What they found was that typically with TM, they look at what happens over 3 months. With this cohort, they measured anxiety after 2 weeks, and 50% reduction in anxiety in 2 friggin' weeks. And of course, any kind of intervention, the more extreme the problem, the bigger the result. But it's just pretty mind blowing. And so the last thing I want to say is that I mentioned that this Walpole prison. Have you heard about this? So probably I'm guessing around 1984. This guy was a postdoc at Harvard, and he goes into Walpole prison, and Carla knows this well. Carla was in Cambridge as well, and he teaches a bunch of inmates TM, and most of them were murderers. Most of them in for murder, and that he followed them for 18 months. And one of the measures he used was Jane Levenger's ego development scale, which looks at kind of somewhat moral judgment, somewhat capacity to be reflective about life, and kind of general kind of emotional and social maturity. But what he found was these prisoners before they started TM, they're at a 5th grade level. He said after 18 months, they were post college level. And he said there wasn't any indoctrination. It wasn't teaching them philosophy. It wasn't teaching them how to think or how to be a better person. It was through the process of effortlessly quieting the mind and the body, experiencing these more profound levels of your own mind that had this transforming effect. And I'll leave you with the thought that if it works in prison, it should work in medical school. So I'd be happy to take any questions or thoughts, associations. Yeah.
Yeah, first of all, I mean, wonderful talk. Thank you for that. Lots of thoughts developing. I think one thing that I was curious about is turn it on. Yeah, so one thing I was curious about is you mentioned this the study with the grooming the rats, right?
Yeah.
And so that got me to think about generational trauma and kind of like the impact, that can have. Myself coming from, a household where my mom had panic attacks and depression, and myself struggling with kind of the same in my, and so I kind of think about, what are ways that I think as healthcare providers, maybe we can look into helping with that. I mean, I understand that TM as a practice is really great. I just think that, I didn't come to it obviously until my age right now. And I think this is something that could have been like very beneficial, like as a child, right? So I don't know if there's something like society wise we could do for that.
Yeah. And I mentioned this Michael Meany, who did these studies with rats. He's one of the world's great psychologists. I mentioned he helped pioneer the study of psychology of epigenetics. What they found was that this experience of being licked and groomed by an affectionate, low-stressed mother, basically it failed to turn on genes that are associated with anxiety and depression. It had this very protective effect, this epigenetic effect. And certainly generational trauma does reflect these changes, not in the genes themselves, but in the way the genes manifest, and these epigenetic changes that can be passed on for generation. And so there's a big literature on kids who have adverse childhood trauma, adverse childhood experiences. I read this brilliant book called Born Anxious about a kid. Certainly know that prenatal anxiety, with high levels of maternal anxiety, the fetuses tend to, the stress response tends to be more reactive in the sensitive gland. And so the ways of kind of normalizing that certainly if we could get young people to meditate, in my opinion, it would transform everything. I mean, I mentioned these quiet time schools. Have you heard about this at all?
No.
So these studies started maybe 20 years ago, 15 years ago. They started having these programs, usually in inner city schools. It didn't start initially in the Bay Area. They go into these god-awful schools, these underserved schools, where all the kids had lost a parent, or lost an uncle or a brother to gun violence, and just so much trauma. And this school is very dysfunctional. Kids were miserable. And they started this quiet time program where students could either meditate or read quietly for 15 minutes twice a day during the school day. And about 90% of the kids in the school did the TM part. And I remember I gave a lecture to the faculty at this is the first school that pioneered this. And before I lectured, the vice principal gave me a tour of the school. And as we went, he said at one point, we walked past, he said, here's the guidance office, the counselor's office. He said, 2 years ago, before we started this program, there would have been 30 kids kicked out of class, running around, fighting, told to go down and see the counselor. You'll see there's not a single kid there. And there's this thing called the California Happy School Survey. And before they started this program, these kids were very low on this kind of happiness study that they do every year in California. After the program had been in school for about 5 years, they had the highest scores of middle school in the state. And it's just, I was presenting to the U.S. Department of Education about 7 or 8 years ago with a social scientist from NYU by the name of Josh Aronson. And Josh had been out to see these quiet time programs. And he told these people at the U.S. Department of Education, said, I've done dozens of studies trying to reduce stress in students. And I've reviewed hundreds of other studies. I've never seen anything like, nothing comes close to what this quiet time program is. So I mean, there's many things that we can do. And certainly exercise is a big deal. Increasing sleep is a big deal. I think some of the mindful techniques in terms of being able to aware of your emotions, it can be useful. But I think that this process of deeply, the way that TM, because it's effortless, the transcending the thinking process altogether, that experience of just inner quietness. That's kind of who you are, the basic level of your being. I think that has such transformative power. Most kids don't want to meditate. But if you build it into a school program, everybody does it. They do it. So I think that and I was struck when I was reading this book, This Born Anxious, about kids who come out of the womb being very easily stressed. About it's just there's nothing you've never thought about. It's exercise, it's meditation, it's sleep. It's increasing diet, it's optimizing sleep. And one of the things that just struck me so much was when I went to this school, the Quiet Time program, was I watched these interviews of these middle school students talking about their experiences of meditating. And I was struck by almost every single kid said, once I started meditating, I was able to sleep through the night for the first time in a year or 2 years or 3 years, because they felt safe enough. At some profound level, they felt safe enough to fall asleep.
So much of what you said tonight reminds me of the cyclicity of nature. You quoted the data thing about Maharishi used to say, all activity rests upon rest. Well, there's day, night, there's inspiration, expiration. And what we've done in our culture is we're jacked up all the time. So we don't have time for the beauty of TM is it gives you an opportunity twice a day to get total rest, and you can come back to full activity thereafter. A nice mnemonic that I learned years ago is neuro, N-E-U-R-O. for the balanced life. N is nutrition, E is exercise, U is learn how to unwind, which is what meditation does. R is rest, get 7.5 hours of sleep. And O is optimize your life through engagement, like you said, and relationship. Neuro.
Yeah.
So simple to remember.
I love it. Thanks, Jim. That's great.
I was just signaling to Duncan to stop sharing so we could hear from Dr. Carroll.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Oh, good.
Click on the stop share.
Thank you. Yeah, hold on.
I just recently saw this article. It was a summary. I guess several decades ago, there was two teenagers that decided for a science experiment. They would try and break the world record for sleep deprivation. And it was just, oh, sorry, I didn't mean this to be like a whole thing. And it was wild because so one got the short end of the stick and had to go through it. And I think he didn't sleep for like 11 days, over 11 days. That was the world record at the time. And, you know, the experiences that he talked about, the hallucinations, all of it, right? But it was interesting because it persisted years after, you know, he had this one-time experience. And it's because kind of what you talked about, the way that it alters your, you know, loss of connections in the brain. It was fascinating. And the Guinness Book of World Records no longer has that record just because they discouraged people from sleep deprivation. But yeah.
Yeah. I remember reading about that as well. And it's just unreal. I mean, you know, at my age, I wake up after 7. I mean, I can't really, I've always been a little bit, how much sleep you need seems to like most human qualities, varies on a normal curve. I mean, and so there's kind of normal variation. But so I need 7. If I routinely got 3 or 4, I'd be psychotic. You know, and the idea of young people who need 9.25, I mean, teenagers after puberty, on average, need 9.25 hours not to feel tired. You know, you take typical teenager in high achieving school, and you know how you measure how sleep deprived you are? You put you in a dark room at 11 o'clock, and you just sit in a comfortable chair and see how long, lying down, and see how long it takes you to fall asleep. And these high school kids, they're asleep within 2 minutes, which again is just profound sleep deprivation. And their EEGs oftentimes look like EEGs of people with narcolepsy. So that this Laurie Santos said, you know, that the Yale undergraduates on average sleep 4 to 6 hours. She consults now with a lot of high schools around the country, and also the really high achieving kids 4 to 6 hours. She said we could fix 90% of the mental health problem in this country if people just slept. And with this balance of rest and activity, as Jim is saying, that and from a Vedic point of view, this rest is the base of activity. The idea Dr. Nader's talked about consciousness being the basis of everything else. And it's a profound, completely silent level of awareness. Basically gives rise to all the change, all the manifestations. So it's a really profound idea. But certainly in your daily life goes better if you're well rested. And I was blown away, Carla, by your saying that the students who meditated, I wasn't surprised, but I was blown away. It felt like they gained 2 to 5 hours of useful time a day. And I've been meditating for it'll be 50 years in October. And still, if I'm at my office and I've been testing kids, I met with parents, did consultations, and I got a bunch of stuff to put away at the end of the day. If I meditate first, it'll take me 10 minutes because I organize, I've been putting the piles in it and make 2 trips to the back, put stuff away. If I don't meditate, it'll take me half an hour. I'll make 6 trips to the back. I can't focus, I can't organize, I can't get a big enough perspective to understand how to do things efficiently. So this idea of making up time, you'll make up time. It really is true. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. I just have kind of a anecdotal question, I guess. You were talking about high achieving students and their increased risk for anxiety and depression. and some other mental health issues. And I've from a personal experience of what I've heard, I know a lot of people that now in their 20s, they're in graduate school or in they're getting diagnosed with ADHD now. And I guess I was curious if that's and I know at least one person, like their doctor, when they got diagnosed, is like, I think you were just highly functional. And then you get to this point where like you're no longer functional, and now we're able to diagnose you. And I guess I've heard that kind of, again, anecdotally from several people. And I guess I was curious if there is actually research on that, which I can also look up too if you don't know. But I was just wondering if in your research about highly functioning students, if that's the case too.
Well, I haven't seen in that body of research, I haven't seen anything about ADHD. But I will say I've tested people for 40 years. And I do see, I mean, it's very common for me to see people who are, who've been able to mask, especially women, girls and women, they mask ADHD because in part, because on average, women are more empathic than men. And girls in school, they're more concerned about hurting their teacher's feelings, or they're more impressing. So you can, if you have ADHD and you're female and you're bright, and you're sitting in class, and you know to nod your head when the teacher's talking, even though your mind may be a million miles away. And so I do see commonly kids in high school, college, even medical students, where it's the first time they reach a certain level of demand and they can't compensate for it anymore. Now, it's also true, when I was in Berkeley, when I flunked out of graduate school, my foot tapped unrelentingly. I'd go to the movies and my foot would be tapping like this. I can't even do it anymore, but and the person next to me at the movies would say, could you stop that? It's annoying. Yeah, sure. As long as I focused on my foot, I could stop it. But as soon as I started watching the movie again, my foot was not tapping. And also, I remember going to the library and trying to study, and I'd have to distract myself every 12 or 13, I was just so stressed. I'd have to distract myself every 12 or 15 minutes. And Amy Arnstein at Yale says stress mimics ADHD. So there is a percentage of people who really become functional. I was functionally ADHD and hyperactive for probably a year due to high stress. And my foot stopped tapping in about 30 days of meditation. I developed a facial tic, and that went away in a couple of months. And I noticed after a couple of months, I could sit and read for 2 hours at a time, as opposed to 12 minutes at a time. And so I think there are people where they don't really have it, but it looks like they do because of the effects of stress on the prefrontal cortex. But I also think there are people who are just got identified late because they're smart and they mask it and they compensate for it really well.
Actually, a talk about that today, like a seminar, I think from the undergraduate Loyola campus where they study ADHD, and that's exactly what they said about like the female students, just because it's like very, like, especially like women acting out, female students acting out in like the hyperactive way, like it's very frowned upon.
Right.
And so they just kind of learn in school not to do that.
Yeah. I remember early in my career, I was so, I got a lot of referrals from Catholic schools. And I was surprised as how many kids I saw, girls were like 15 or 16. And they on testing, they obviously had ADHD. All the tests of attention they sucked at, but nobody ever saw it. And I realized that if you're female and you're attractive and you're smart, it's just really hard for people to see it.
I want to thank you so much, and I'd like to ask.
Oh yeah, great.
Speak.
Dr. Carroll, do you have any remarks?
You're muted.
You're muted.
There, how about now?
Yes.
Can you hear me okay?
Hi, Dick.
Hi, Bill, how are you?
Great.
Really, really wonderful. Let me just make one comment to the group. It's interesting, and every time I listen to you, I hear something even more wonderful. And you said something today that really caught my attention, specifically for this group of individuals. And we kept talking about highly functioning, highly successful individuals. And when we talk about medical students, just by the fact that they're there, they're highly functional, highly successful. But the success now is a very, very different kind of success, because we're trying to achieve success not for ourselves per se, but so we can provide what we have to other people. It's a very, very different phenomenon. So if I'm a bond trader and I do extremely well for myself, or if I'm on the stock market trading money for myself, I'm very successful and I do great and everything looks wonderful. But if I'm trading other people's money and I'm not so successful, I impact them in a very negative way. If I am very successful, other people benefit from that. As a physician, we have to realize that taking care of ourselves is also taking care of our patients. Well, I like that. I just made that up. I like that. Taking care of ourselves is actually taking care of our patients, because what we are for our patients is what they will get from us. And if we're tired and we're stressed and we're not thinking clearly and we're making mistakes, we will provide that. We will give that to our patients. That's one of the reasons that people, medical administrators, finally realized it wasn't wise to have people working so many nights in a row, because as you pointed out, we hurt people. And we realized that the impact it was having on us impacts other people. So this is not just about us, it's about those that we are going to be taking care of. And if we can't take care of ourselves, we can't do an effective job of taking care of other people.
That's a great point.
Duncan, I hope you wrote that down.
I noticed the whole audience was scratching it down on the page.
We recorded it, Dick.
I want to thank all of the students. It's been wonderful to teach you Transcendental Meditation. Of course, we want to thank Dr. Stixrud for coming all the way from Bethesda, Maryland, to talk to us this evening. Let's give Dr. Stixrud a round of applause. We could talk with you all night, actually. We could talk with you. We want to continue talking with you for weeks and weeks and months to come.